fear. My example is really, really, truly fear. So in 2004, I moved from Seattle to Rapid City. Concur they put me on a performance plan and said, we don't think this is going to work. This is before remote was a thing. And they said, basically, we're giving you 6 weeks to figure this out and see if it works. We're opening a rec right behind you, and we're going to start recruiting.
Welcome to the Additive Advantage podcast. I'm Danny Mason, here with my co-host, Sean Anderson. And on this show, we talk about what actually works when it comes to additive manufacturing, how to move beyond pilots, align strategy with execution, and make innovation deliver real results. Thanks for listening. Let's dive in.
Today's guest, Todd Gagne, has lived on both sides of the coin when it comes to creating technology and driving technology at scale. Todd was one of the leaders at Concur that saw that business scale from scrappy startup to multi-billion-dollar organization, and now runs Wildfire Labs, an accelerator for software startups. And he is doing something that most people do once or twice in a lifetime, getting to oversee that for dozens of companies every year. Excited to have you hear from him. Let's kick off the interview and see what we can learn. Welcome to this episode of the Additive Advantage. I am excited about today. With us today, we have Todd Gagne, and Todd brings a wealth of experience both in terms of technology as well as leadership in building businesses. And for our listeners, where our goal is to engage with leaders who are responsible for delivering real business results with technology. In our case, that's usually additive manufacturing technology, but the ingredients it takes to win tend to be the same all over. Todd, could you introduce yourself to our audience so they can get to know you and your background?
Yeah. Thanks for having an invite, Sean. I really appreciate it, and excited to talk a little bit today. I guess the way I usually give as a quick intro is I basically have kind of 3 chapters to my career. The first chapter was really just a pure entrepreneur that didn't really know what he was doing. So I had some trash can fires in there where basically I lost everybody's money. I eventually got better at it. I sold the last 2 businesses that I did in that stage. That was enough experience to get me out to the West Coast. I followed my wife. She had just graduated with a master's in computer science from School of Mines. She was working at Microsoft at the time, and she said, come out to the West Coast. They're hiring anybody. And I said, I'm anybody. And so I got a job at Microsoft. I lasted all of 9 months. I didn't like it. It was huge in comparison to running my own shop. The job they gave me was about that big. And so I quickly looked for something else. And so the bulk of my career is with a company called Concur Technologies. I spent 19 years there. I was an early employee, probably maybe in the top first 40 employees, I guess is probably where I was at. We were hemorrhaging a ton of money at that time. If it had been able to read a balance sheet, I probably wouldn't have gone, but I stuck with it. And I basically got a bunch of jobs that I wasn't qualified to do. They allowed me to do engineering is where I started. And then I moved into product management. I managed a bunch of legacy product lines. I got to some GM responsibilities. I ran marketing. I had some sales responsibilities. I had a bunch of global jobs. And then towards the end, basically, I ran global products for the company. So in 2014, we got bought for about $8.3 billion. I stayed 2 more years with the acquisition with SAP. And then since 2016, I've really been working on trying to build kind of an entrepreneurial ecosystem around software in Western South Dakota. So that means everything from consulting type work to angel investment to what I've been doing for the last 3 years, which is helping entrepreneurs kind of in a startup school called Wildfire Labs. And so people come to us, they have a business idea, and over 6 months, we really help them kind of go from customer discovery to the build process to go to market. And then if they want to raise capital, they can go do it with the goal of really trying to create more technology jobs in our region.
Well, that's a fantastic story. How in the world you accumulated all of that experience with a lot less gray hair than me? We'll have to have a separate episode about that. You can tell me about your hair care routine and why it's working better than mine.
Yeah. Well, we'll see about that.
What I admire about him came through big time. Number one, he's a guy who actually builds things. And he's a guy that puts his money where his mouth is. He understands taking risk. He understands being the guy whose rear end is on the line to make it work. And I know that most of you will identify with that and appreciate that. Todd, I want to start out with something that we hear over and over and over, where a leader might be at the VP level, sometimes SVP level, gets the blessing and curse of being informed that they're being handed one of the company's big strategic initiatives around, nearshoring, reshoring. Hey, go leverage this additive manufacturing thing to tighten up our supply chain. let's implement some technology, drive some cost savings, and get our business ready for the future. And then what we hear is, okay, well, I kind of got tasked to go do this. And then I have a heck of a time getting the resources I need and getting the outcome of whatever I studied and decided we should do approved. I know, from the time you and I've spent together that you've seen that same challenge in your days at Concur. What would you share with our guys like you and me who come from an engineering background but are business unit leaders trying to deal with that challenge?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think it's. I think you nailed it on the head. I always looked at it and said, I'm paid to execute at the end of the day. That's basically what it is. Right? Good ideas do not get bonuses in your paycheck at all, full stop. And so you really have to think about it in I would think in gates, where it's, in a lot of cases, I was trying to have initiatives that I thought were important and get them on the docket. And so in a lot of cases, they weren't even to the point where we said, hey, these are the 3 or 4 initiatives the company is going to go do, and we have ownership for it. I think there's a lot of work to do to even get to that point, whether it's politicking or understanding the context of kind of what the business is really trying to go do. And I think I shared in a quick example of this. I had a really good business idea within Concur for a product that we wanted to go build. But, basically I went through all the work, I built it all out, and I got to my COO and he said, Todd, this probably isn't going to generate $100 million in the next 5 years. Good idea. If he came to me with this idea probably 10 years ago, I would have funded it in a heartbeat. So context is super important when you're talking about these initiatives and really what's going to move the needle. At that point in time, we were $1 billion company, something that was going to build, $50 million in 5 years. That's nice, but it's not something we're going to put money towards. It really needs to be something that can grow dramatically, quickly, internally, cross-sell to the customer in my case, and really move the needle. But let's say you have this initiative like you're talking about, and now it's up to you to go do. I guess the first part I always start with is define success and failure for me. And so many times I think executives have these ideas and they say, this is what we want to go do. And I'm always saying, hey man, just tell me how you define success and failure. And one of the examples I give you was one of the first opportunities I had to be a VP at Concur. They gave me an opportunity and I took a look at it and I asked this exact question. I said, if I'm going to take this job, how do you define success? And they couldn't answer it for me. And I didn't take the job. And so I basically left money on the table because I knew that if I couldn't define success, I didn't want to get into a trap where they're basically left up to somebody's emotion or you're part of a political environment where you're going to do that. So that'd be the first place that I would start, is really kind of gating it on success and failure. From there, really, what's the resourcing plan? How many dollars am I getting? Where are these resources coming from? And really do a resource map. So a lot of this, Sean, from my perspective is, if I'm going to own this, I need to own these elements of this before I get very far. And so I am not going to stand up in front of everybody and put my name on that initiative until I basically have some of these things really finalized. If I have what defines success and failure, and I have a resource map and a commitment from a budget perspective, then I can start going into operation mode. So let me just stop there and see if that resonates. But to me, before you put my name on an initiative that's going out to the rest of the company, I'm not going forward until I have those 2 elements.
Well, there's a couple of golden nuggets in what you shared, Todd. And I'm having a flashback to my Schneider Electric days where, I could see these opportunities that to me look like huge low-hanging fruit in our business, but I would float these up and I would get okay, so Sean, if that goes really well, what's the revenue in year 3 and gross margin? Yep. And I would give them a number that because I was the sales VP at the time. So I was a guy that I didn't want to give them too big of a number because I was going to have to own that sucker.
Yep. So I think this is going to go back to like a mental model for me that basically gets applied to a bunch of different places. And it's really just about systems thinking. The idea of any decision that you have to drive is really trying to drive it through a system. And a system contains people. People have goals, initiatives, alignment, and they're going to act in selfish ways, right? That's always what it boils down to. They're going to do what's right for them. And so I think when you start to map all of these people out and you start to say, who are decision makers, who are influencers, just like we do on the sales side, right? You take the kind of same concept you do from a sales, like an enterprise sales environment, you apply it to an internal process that you're trying to do. And you start to think about, if I gave this person this material or information, what would they do with it? And if you can start to make those people kind of predictable in your environment, you're starting to play chess, right? You're starting to move things around the board. And I think this is a skill that basically, as Concur got more and more complicated, like that became something you had to go do, right? And so this is not about Todd being right. This is about enabling other people to be right and be the heroes and carry the water. Because if they got to their goals and objectives and they're heroes in the eyes of their manager or whatever, they're going to do your initiative. And so some of this is, do you care about like the end game, or do you care about the little fights and skirmishes you have to go do? And so a lot of what I ended up doing was kind of mapping all that stuff out and saying, there are probably people I can run over, and there's people that I have to go through. And the people you're going through, you got to basically get alignment and make sure that you're aligned, because they're not somebody you're just going to run over. And I mean that in a pejorative way. I mean, obviously, there's people that carry more influence than others in the organization. So let me just stop there and see if the systems thinking, the mapping of the people, the reasons why they do, and making them motivated. And if you can give them and repackage information where you know they'll be predictable, you could start to build a plan around how you get an initiative across the finish line. I think basically it's what motivates people, right? And so, in Concur, there's a handful of folks that basically carried more power. And so depending on the initiatives that you were doing, whether it's internal or something that you're building external or a new initiative, like there's just different players on that. And those players all have kind of motivations, and they have goals and objectives, and they're comped in similar ways to you. What you want to do is figure out what those ways are, because that's the way they're going to change. That's what their behavior is going to go do. So if they're motivated for money or bonuses or objectives, understanding what those things are going to drive where their resources are going to happen. And so all you're trying to do is just understand the psyche of why they do the things they're trying to do. And is yours totally orthogonal to what they're trying to do? Or can you find a way that there's little friction and they become supporters of your initiatives? And so a lot of this is kind of some, like we talk about discovery, another scary term, but it's really trying to understand kind of what motivates them so that you can build a plan that basically either is adversarial and you understand that and you got to figure it out, or it's something that they will benefit you and move forward with it because they can claim credit. It makes their initiatives go faster and have a higher degree of success.
You're touching on so many important things about how to move an initiative through an organization. One of the things I tend to build into my own map, because although I think I'm a pretty good sales guy, I can't always get everybody 100% on board. But when you map out like, hey, can I win if I only get compliance in this team or this department? Or do they need to be a champion? Or can they just ride in the caboose of this train and be okay? Because usually you can't get everyone up there in the locomotive, driving the train forward. That to me seems like a behavior that most engineers and technical leaders would really grab a hold of, because, kind of risk management and deciding where those pitfalls lie. But I find that oftentimes people tend to, like I did when I was young, naively assume everyone's going to love my idea. How would you deal with that? And how do you work that into this whole concept of mapping the organization?
So maybe I'll take a side piece to this. So I have this whole concept of building profiles for anybody I work with, and I do it today. So building profiles would mean, let's take a look at the individual that I'm working at. And let's say it's my boss in this case that I'm going to do. And so I'm trying to get them to buy into either an initiative, I need more resources, whenever it happens to be. And so building a persona with them or a profile of them is really understanding what motivates them. How do they best learn, right? Like a lot of times, some people are good at just going to the dry board and brainstorming an idea. Some people want something that's written down where they can give you some feedback on it. Somebody, like in conflict, how do they deal with conflict? How do they define success? So I have this kind of like checklist of everybody I worked with. And so I started it personally with all of my direct reports, because I was trying to figure out like how to add value to them. And what I was trying to do is be a dynamic leader, right? So if I'm managing one person, and they have a different set of skills, I need to be dynamic as a manager and do that. Versus I'm working with Sean, and that's totally different, right? He has a different set of skills and wants to hear it. And so I'll use a couple of just super easy examples on this. So I worked for two bosses. One of them his name was Mike Hilton. He was a founder in the company. And he basically never wanted you to bring something that was fully baked to him. He always wanted you to ask for his help, right? And so you might have the best idea in mind and you give it to him, and he would just like say, no, I'm not going to support that. But if you went to him and said, Mike, I got this idea, but it's kind of half baked and I need some like help on it, and he was able to like add value to that, he would champion it like no tomorrow because it was like him. He actually felt like he had some vested interest in that. The other guy that I worked for was a consultant. He came from the consulting world. And so all he wanted was the story. He wanted the customer story. He wanted the customer impact. He wanted the emotion. So in both those cases, I could have taken the exact same data and repackaged it into two different ways and had two different outcomes based on who they were and what they really valued. And to me, that was an eye-opener that said, I think almost everybody's like that. The question is, can you unlock that and basically do that in a way that accelerates your entire network around you?
We all want to be recognized for our uniqueness, but we can very quickly breeze by the opportunity to recognize other people's uniqueness. And, when you used a phrase, I want to be a dynamic leader. And the way that we tend to phrase that at B9 Creations is we'd say, you can manage from your own needs or you can lead to their needs. And obviously we always want to lead to the other person's needs. Where'd you learn that? How did that become a part of how you do what you do?
Fear. My example is really, truly fear. So in 2004, I moved from Seattle to Rapid City. Concur they put me on a performance plan and said, we don't think this is going to work. This is before remote was a thing. And they said, basically, we're giving you 6 weeks to figure this out and see if it works. We're opening a rec right behind you and we're going to start recruiting. So I got to Rapid and I was kind of like, oh crap, man, what do I do? I was managing not a ton of people, I think 8-10 folks at the time. And I would say I was a pretty average manager at that point in time. I was wanting to be the smartest guy in the room, and I wanted to have somebody else deliver bad news, and I wanted to be the guy that delivered good news, like a lot of entry-level managers. And so that's kind of where I was at from a maturity standpoint. And so this journey was about, how do I add value remotely? There was barely dial-in conference lines at that point, right? We didn't have Zoom and Slack and all these tools. We were talking about WebEx and Blue Jeans and all these things. And the problem is nobody would even call you, right? You would supposed to be in this call, but they just forget about you. And so I could see very clearly that I was going to get marginalized because I wasn't getting the data and I wasn't participating in the calls and I wasn't adding value. So guess what? 6 weeks was coming and I could see where that was going to go. So what I started to do was I started saying, let's take a psychology approach to this. Let's figure out what the people are on my team need. Let's understand their strengths. Let's understand their weaknesses. Let's understand their motivations. Let's understand how they best work. And Todd, as a manager, needs to reinvent the way he engages with people. And so this is where this profile idea came up for me. And I spent a lot of time doing this down, horizontally, and up, right? So my direct reports, all my cross-functional peers, and then my bosses. And what I found was if I stayed disciplined to it, I basically had an outsized impact. And really what I was trying to do was just maximize the talent that was on my team, right? That's all you're trying to do. And there was one guy in particular that I think was really interesting. He had bounced around like 4 or 5 teams and basically had been delegated to my team as this is the last stop before you're done. And he kind of knew it. His personality was introvert and he was pretty quiet. And Concur had this like culture of let's go to the dry board and let's like brainstorm some ideas and everybody's going to throw their ideas out and then best ideas win. And he was just terrible at it, right? He would sit like a bump in a log and he would not really participate. What I realized was if I gave him the outline of what the brainstorming was going to be 24 hours in advance, that dude had so many good answers for it. And he lit up like a Christmas tree because he was prepared and he knew how the process worked. And now he had something of value to add. And he only talked when he had value to add. That guy went on to have a very good career at Concur, but like he was one stop away from leaving. And to me, that was the unlock, right? He's an introvert. He needs to be like managed differently in a company that has a lot of extroverts and likes to brainstorm. And so that, I think that's the whole process. And so I've droned on a little bit, but like fear was really what drove me to do this. And then this is probably one of the keys to like my professional success in my entire career. I think you already said it. You got to be self-aware. You got to be humble. I mean, I think I always joke at Concur was every year you had to learn 50% something new. You just didn't know what 50%, right? You had to throw away and can iterate on. So, but to be totally honest, investing in people, it didn't matter if you were a team of 2. Like, I mean, I look at Wildfire, we have 10 or 11 people that work with us. I don't care if it's that small or if you're managing a team of 500, 600, right? Like, I mean, those principles continue to go and they're timeless. And I think that if you put it in a perspective of I'm trying to maximize talent, like that's different. That's a different mindset than just to get to my objectives. And I didn't always like it's funny, my career went from I got the cast offs at the beginning when I moved, where at the end, people knew that basically I was good at developing talent. They knew that I was going to move on after 3 to 5 years. And so they want to be part of that leadership team to get the next opportunity. So my job got super easy as the problems got larger, the teams got larger, but talent, you became a talent magnet within the company. And so to me, that was a huge win where it's like, okay, I'm getting better and better talent. It solves a ton of different problems for me as the company is scaling. So maybe that's one. And I can't emphasize that enough. I don't care if you're working with somebody, at Love Inc. and dealing on a one-on-one for somebody that comes out of jail, you got the same kind of objectives you're trying to do as you're trying to mentor somebody that's early in their careers. So that's one. I think the other part of it is you got to kind of learn how to read the tea leaves a little bit, right? I think that was another thing that understanding, I don't know if it's the culture, like there's a sense that I guess I had at Concur about where things were going and like what is going to be important and what is not. And a lot of that is you got to digest a lot of information about the business, whether it's sales numbers or competitors or pressure from investors, like there's all of these kind of business acumen kind of things that you're basically digesting and you're kind of making some bets in your head. Where is the company going and where am I best positioned to go do that? And so to me, if you've got the people side of it, you got this other like intuition about where things are going and you're good at execution, like those are all big blocks, but man, they overcame a lot of ills and it allowed you to continue to iterate.
How did you go from, hey, I got this degree in geology to yeah, I can work on software and yeah, I can lead these people. What in the world ever led you to believe you even could do those things or should do those things?
It's probably not the most flattering answer, honestly, Sean, is probably a disdain for authority is probably how that boils down to in some cases, right? I think I probably had a lot of people in my world tell me that I can't do something. And so you kind of get a little chip on your shoulder. And I think as I finished, school, I was like saying, I didn't really like the jobs that basically I was looking for. I was looking at a lot of geographical information systems roles where basically you're working on a computer, somebody gives you requirements, you do the work and you send it off. That didn't really resonate with me. And so a lot of what I ended up doing was saying, let's do something different. And so that's where the startup idea came from. And, like early on, it was a mess, right? I think my very first one, I just really didn't understand go to market and sales. And so we built a decent product. We had a number of people, but like sales was just slow and I really didn't put as much effort into that. But, I learned from it and I continue to go forward. And so I guess I think that was the main driver to go do something on my own. I think the second piece to it is I like people in general. And I felt like there was some propensity to leadership from a standpoint of I can help people take risk, but think it's not that big of a risk, right? Why would you come to my startup, right? And so if you can give them a vision about what you're trying to do, if you can get them excited about it and then show them the small chunk that you're asking them to do, and they can see themselves in that, that's the catalyst of it. I got better over time. I got way more sophisticated in the skills and experiences, but fundamentally, I think that's where you take like a disdain for authority and the ability to give a vision with a piece of execution for somebody. Those are probably the core elements that got me started.
So all these things we've been talking about today, you've got Wildfire Labs, you're working with founders, or sometimes it's a very small founding team. These people are probably drowning in, I got to find product market fit. How am I going to pay for this? I got to raise some money. How do you get them to incorporate some of these business and people leadership things into that sense of overwhelm as they're trying to get their own, in this case, their initiative as a new company off the ground?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it always goes back to, it goes back to something you and I'd already talked about, which is we're paid to execute. And I think that I would say, I love founders that are just willing to execute. And so I think what they suffer from is there's 15 number one priorities. And guess what? That doesn't exist, right? There's one number one priority. And so if we can tell them what the top 2 or 3 things are for the stage they're at, and they can focus and execute on that, then we can help them with the next ones are. And so I think a lot of what our program is, don't look at entrepreneurship and building a company as this overwhelming 50 different things coming at you. It's really, what do you got to go do this week? And so a lot of what our program is really trying to do is basically line you up on these dependencies on, you get this block done, you get to work on the next block. And if you get good at execution and you're good at prioritization of what you need to work on, you can work yourself out of a lot of different things, right? we've seen, people, even Concur. I think we had some things that were wrong from a strategy standpoint at various times, but we are very good at executing. And so, okay, great, we just need to pivot. But we are good at building a performance culture where basically there was owners for things, there was definitions of success and failure, and there was a good project worksheet of who's going to go do what and what are the dependencies. And at the end of the quarter, end of the month, whatever it happens to be, we were pretty good at executing on it. And I think you take those principles and you bring them down to smaller teams, and really what they want is just focus and execution.
If you were coaching, if you were a business unit president and you're coaching some VP who's supposed to put together an initiative to figure out how additive manufacturing can help your business, how would you coach that person around balancing, understanding technical capabilities with weaving it into the context of what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. And I think, I managed engineering teams at Concur quite a bit, and then, basically had product responsibilities. I think that most engineering shops in my world want to build everything, right? And so as Concur started to go globally, we needed requirements for some subway card in Japan. There was some tax uniqueness in Brazil. All of a sudden you start to have all these nuances to it. And of course the engineering department would say, I can build that. I can build that. I can build that. And we kind of said, yeah, I'm sure you can, but there's a sunk cost to that, and there's an opportunity cost of what you're not going to build by doing it. And so is that the most important thing for us to be building in our organization? So I do think there's an alignment and an education there. Eventually what we ended up doing was building a program for, third party developers to build some of this nuance and then have it available in an app store, essentially, where they basically integrate it with the product. So a lot of defined API endpoints, ways that we could, manage upgrades, where they can customize what fields they had access to in the database and let them go build it. And that worked really, really well. So I do think from a coaching perspective, you have to give them the context to what you're going to go do, and acknowledge that they want to build everything because they know that it'll be built well then. But on the flip side, is this the most important problem for us to go solve? The answer is usually no. And so I think playing to their ego in some cases, I want you on the most important problem that's going to move the needle for Concur, and you need to focus on this, not these other things.
Well, everybody who's listening, you should write that down, because that is how, we, as an engineer, I can pick on engineers a little bit, but we're really good about those can questions. Sometimes we struggle with the should questions.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Rarely, at least in our business, we're not trying to develop a flux capacitor. Most of the stuff we're working on it's engineering. It's not science. It isn't a question of can we do it, but the question that is so dangerous is should we?
You have to understand, what's the system on the other side for adoption, right? Is that my CSMs that are basically going to go sell it? Is it going to be part of a net new sale process that I need to go do? And so for me, it really focused product managers to get off their seat, talk to customers, talk to all the go-to-market types of people, understand what marketing collateral we need to do, understand what the competitive landscape looked like, what's the pricing really look like. It made them really think through some of these a lot more detailed than maybe we had in the past.
Yeah, at the end of the day, what you're coming back to is understanding the needs of whether it's a downstream internal customer or it's that external customer. I've heard you make a comment before that handing them something that's 10 or 20% better isn't good enough.
That's correct.
To incentivize behavior. How do you know what is enough? If it's not 10 or 20% better, how do you get their feedback and understand what is enough?
So in the Wildfire world, we probably have a couple of different criteria for this. We've had a handful of customers that basically have sold contracts before the product was even built. And so you're like, that's a pretty good indicator. That's a hell yeah, I need that thing, right? And I'm willing to slap some dollars down to basically fund it to go do. So that's one. We probably get 10 to 15% of those are in that bucket. The next one, which is the minimum bar for us, is you go through your customer discovery, and basically you have your set of features that you're going to go build for your minimal viable product, your MVP. If we can't get more than 60% of the people you interviewed for customer discovery to sign up for a beta, you do not move forward. There's not enough value in that process. And so those are some of the tools that we use internally in our process and to do it. I think even at Concur, we definitely had some people that were willing to prepay for a discount on product because they thought it was that impactful. Again, it was probably less than 10% of products or features that we put out. But that is a very good buying opportunity. I think that all the stuff that we're seeing in AI, I think you're starting to see people rethink their workflows, right? Saying, hey, I got this CRM and it kind of, like I'm spending a ton of time in this going back and forth. If you could basically make it so that all of my transcripts and all the work that I do on the phone is basically pushed into that, you're seeing people go, fine, like that takes a ton of load off my salespeople. I'm interested in being a pioneer on something like that, because the biggest problem we have with the CRMs is nobody wants to update it, right? They feel like it's not value add. And
Yeah.
I think you could look across the board and say legacy B2B tools are going to have to go through this iteration. And I think if you really sat down from first principles and thought through this process with new AI technology, you'd probably redesign them in a different way.
Well, you've opened a can of worms there around the topic of AI, and you know, I got asked this question yesterday. I get asked this question all the time. People talk about, how is AI transforming your business? And I love that you brought up the concept of first principles, because if you automate a crappy process, all you've done is increase your ability to do crap. And it's, back to can versus should. Can we automate this? Sure, we can. Should we? If we were going to leverage and B9, we have an entire 2026 strategic initiative around leveraging technology to drive efficiency and customer experience. And for sure, our team uncovered a couple of things that, oh my gosh, we're spending how many hours of someone's time on, heaven forbid you say data entry, but then if you really want to give me an aneurysm, say that we've now entered the same data in 3 different systems. And then, I might need a minute to get my blood pressure back down. But to your point around workflows, I'm curious, where do you see this being done well in terms of leveraging AI to actually change what gets done and improve and add more value, versus where do you see, we're just automating crap and we're scaling crap? Broad
Uh,
question, but I think the reason I
yeah,
ask it that way is people are looking for, what does good look like with AI? And that's something I think as humans, if you show us what good looks like, we can go replicate it. But sometimes we struggle to identify what good looks like early on.
yeah. And so I mean, I guess I think that the impact to AI today is unevenly distributed, I think is really the honest answer. I think we have sophisticated tools that are finding application places that they can really make a big difference. So I look at the world in coding, and I think that, things like Cursor, Lovable, Cloud Code, they're taking a developer that has 10 years of experience and basically multiplying them by 2 to 3 times X. So I just think that if you understanding core code principles and understand architecture, essentially what you're doing is you're creating agents to go do elements of this, and you're an orchestrator as the developer anymore. And so a lot of organizations have legacy code lines, so they can't do that. They can't really do that. They're using more traditional tools on top of it. We just got an entrepreneur recently that basically got a quote for a piece of functionality that was $360,000 and 9 months worth of work. And of course, their head just blew up and say, like, I got 50K. What can I do? And we basically gave him a quote internally of using developers that are 10 years in the industry. We gave him a quote for not the exact same. We basically brought the functionality down $37,000, and we think we can do it in 2.5 months. So that is an area where like the scale is just dramatic. I think that where you're going to see a lot of bad uses of it and being poor is SEO, blogs, content development. Like they're just automating crap. And so these things are not great at creating unique voices. They're basically an amalgamation of a whole bunch of different things. So that's a space that I think you have to be very, very careful with. I do think that there is an opportunity to use technologies like N8N is a workflow automation platform that you can use AI in. And internally, we've kind of said everybody needs to find 40% of their job that are capable of automation. And it's kind of arbitrary, and it's probably maybe a harsher number than you want. But what it's trying to do is ask them to say, if you could take off the crap part of your job and move up the value food chain, what would you be working on? And again, this goes all the way back to, how do you maximize talent? Do you want me to like spend time trying to find guests for our podcast and listening to podcasts that they've already done, reading their Substack, looking at what they've done on X? Probably not. But if I could automate that, that would take 5 or 6 hours out of my week. Great, go do that. So I just think that everybody, when they look at their job and saying, what are things that are rote that you probably could automate? And then what would you do if you had that opportunity to do more? It's not like I go home early. It's basically you just move up the value food chain and you're basically solving a different problem.
And I don't care if it's AI or any other form of technology. Obviously, AI is transformative on a scale we probably haven't seen since the internet became widely available.
I agree.
But The companies that win will be the companies that figure out, how do you make more of the human by leveraging the technology? Not how do you eliminate the human. Now, it might be we eliminate the human from this low level, thing that frankly is, beneath this person and probably no person should have to do anymore anyway. But to your point, it isn't that, Todd goes home at noon now and he's bugging his wife because he's not sure what to do. Todd knows what are the things that based on his God-given gifts and talents he should be doing more of. And you're taking time out of this bucket and you're putting it here to create more value. And I think the pressure is on leaders not to blindly implement. And I'll just say technology, not even being specific to AI, but don't automate crap. Help your people find that best and highest value and push more time and energy to that bucket. And if you as the leader aren't sure, if I took my team and I said, I've got these 8 people, what are each of their gifts and talents? And if I could get 40% more time in the areas of these employees' strengths, what could I do with our business? That's the way leaders have got to be thinking. And then you got to come back and say, okay, well, back to like, if you can show them how they'd be winning or growing, if I can show them, Sally, Ted, Javier, here's a way for you to get 40% of your time into the things that help you create the most value. You want that promotion. You want that opportunity. Are you going to get that by staying down here doing, data entry? Or are you going to get it by putting 40% more of your time into these things that create value? Now, all of a sudden they're on board. Doesn't mean we don't all have to get out of our comfort zone and learn new things, but also, you threw out that number and you said, is that maybe a little high and maybe a little uncomfortable? Yes. But my own experience has been, if you worked for me and I said, Todd, you got to come up with a way to do this 5% better.
Right.
How much are you really going to feel challenged to change if I throw you the 5? Or even if I said, Todd, 10% better, you could probably come up with a way to get 10% better and really not fundamentally change much. When you throw out, that 40% number, unless I've been really poorly mismanaged, there's probably not 40% of slack in my job where I could just, wring it a little tighter and get that much better. I'm going to have to be willing to set aside some fundamental things and do them differently. So I love that push. And I just want to encourage leaders, if you continually set low goals of your team, they will continually achieve low goals. And if you're not challenging them at that level, don't be shocked when they don't bring you home run innovations.
Yeah. And I guess one thing I don't want to overlook either is a culture of change, right? Like I think that, your example is people don't want to adopt it because they're of fear, right? They're afraid of what their job is going to be or what, evolving. And I think that like as leaders, especially in any sort of technology, we have to be able to have a culture that you're going to be taken care of, that things are going to evolve and it's safe to try some things, right? I think at Concur, we had this kind of thing where it's like failure is okay. It's just, if we're not failing, we're not pushing the envelope far enough. I mean, and I think as a strategy, that has been great in my career, like any place I've ever landed. Be aggressive. And I think that some percentage of this, you're going to fail. What did you learn from it? And what did you apply going forward? If you're not going to make that mistake again, totally fine. And so, but I do think you want to take your employees on this journey with you, because this is one that's going to be transformational. And the people that adopt it early will do very well. The people that don't, it's going to be a slog for your career as well as just being employed at some point in time.
Agreed. We have a phrase I actually stole from a leader I worked for right out of college. He talked a lot about speeding tickets versus parking tickets. And he says, Sean, I'm really pretty tolerant of speeding tickets. If you're moving fast and you're trying to make things happen, it ain't always going to work the first time. You're going to break some things. And as long as you're not breaking the same thing multiple times, I'm pretty okay with that. He said, if you get a parking ticket, you're not moving and somebody has to come tell you to move. Because you're not going to get many of those. We don't tolerate that in our culture. And so I always felt like it really freed me up as an employee and Lord knows I racked up some speeding tickets over time and probably put his theory to the test, but he stood by his word. But if you could free your employees up to say, hey, look, clearly I'm trying to make the business better and yep, this didn't work. And then your question about, okay, so what are you going to do now that you've learned whatever you've learned from that? You brought up another vulnerable topic, Todd, around fear. This came up earlier. My own experience has been there's this continuum. We all have fears internally, right? Of, oh my gosh, can I get good enough to succeed at the next level? Or what if my company figures out that I'm 2 months behind on this big project? Am I smart enough, especially when you get this much gray hair, like, am I just going to be overrun by these 25-year-olds to the external fears that are like, hey, I just got put on a performance improvement plan. And oh, by the way, I'm now a remote employee. How in the world am I going to dig out of this? What I've found is the sooner we can act on those fears while they're still very internal, like, hey, AI is changing the workplace. I look in the mirror and I'm like, I'm not a, you know, 25-year-old, how am I going to stay relevant? How is AI going to change the things that I think I bring the best and highest value in? If I start working on it while it's still a little internal fear, as opposed to my board comes to me and says, Sean, we've hired you to run this technology company and we're eons behind. Well, at that point, my opportunity to cure the problem, that window may have closed. But as humans, if we can take, for the most part, those things that we recognize internally and start acting against them in a constructive way early on, 99% of those will never come to pass. When we wait until it's something that's smacking us in the face, I don't know what the percentage is, but a much higher percentage of them may become reality. And that's, it's something that I would encourage everybody. That little voice in there is there for a reason. It's just how soon are you going to start acting on it? And if you choose not to act on something, be okay with your choice and just own the consequences. You can't act on everything. You got to decide, where are you best positioned to go create value and take action on those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you're dead on. And I think, we used to have a core value of confronting the brutal facts. And that was kind of one of our things. And so, you take something like this and it's like, let's just acknowledge it. What does that mean? And then there needs to be some level of trust, right? Trust that leadership, your manager, the person next to you, we're all seeing this the same way. We're all going through a shared experience. This is going to be painful. And then, as we talked about before, how do I bring down something that's scary like that into bite-sized chunks to give you a chance to move forward on it? Some people, all you need is a couple of wide-ranging touch points and they're off and running. Maybe somebody else basically needs handhold me, do the brown bag, give me the exercise, tell me what to go do. But you have to meet them where they're at, right? But I think this culture of acknowledge the issues and build trust with your employees that will do the right things, I think is imperative to leading change.
I would agree. And you mentioned something earlier about the extent to which not only tolerance for change, but frankly, execution around change is a core part of your culture. If I bring it back to how do people win with additive manufacturing, maybe the last thing I would ask Todd is, how do you assess when you were thinking about a different technology, like what's the organization's readiness or capacity to even succeed with this or pull this off and build that into your plan? How do you get a pulse for that to kind of, assuming you've asked the questions you talked about, like, hey, what's the definition of success? What are the resources right? How do you take a pulse of, what's our capacity to even implement this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I'm probably way too aggressive on most of the stuff that I do. And so I think maybe I've gotten better at this at the time. I mean, I remember just an example, even with Wildfire in the last year or so, Aaron Granager, who's on my team, I talked about some stuff and it was a deer in headlights, right? And I basically realized I'd gone too far, right? I had spent so much time understanding it and I hadn't done enough job of meeting where they're at and then figuring out what the organization was willing and able to digest. And so I do think as a leader, that's part of what you have to go do. I think that part of this too is you got to have some hands-on understanding, or at least for me, I feel like I have to have some hands-on. So like this past weekend, I figured out some stuff about how to automate some work process, I can't write JSON code, but yet I could figure out how I could get chat to do it. And it basically would enable almost anybody in an organization to actually write some automation. And so it's funny, like this morning, we had a marketing meeting on kind of those things. And so, but you had to take them on this journey of saying, where are you calling uncle? Right? Like what can we digest and what can't you digest? And so a lot of this is a framework of where you want to go, creating the North Arrow, the value of what you're trying to do with a new technology, and then gauging based on what they have, what they're willing to take from a risk perspective. And so each one of our people probably has a different risk profile or a growth profile that they're trying to go do. And so we have to kind of gauge what they're willing to go do in that area. There's another guy on our on our team called Tom Olson. Tom is not a developer, but he's now building the front end of most of our founders' applications because he learned it. And so, his trajectory and his ceiling's pretty high. And so his level of adoption, we gave him a couple of tutorials and we sat down and showed him how to do this. And he went off on his own and figured a whole bunch of it out. Great. But that's where he's going to go. And then we've got other people that probably don't have that level of appetite. And so collectively, you need to understand what you're going to message and then meet people kind of where they're at to really kind of move some of these initiatives along, and is my opinion.
Fantastic, Todd. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. For our listeners, I got to believe if you have ever been in charge of leading any technology initiative, you found something in here that you could put to use and create value, even if it's just, face your fears and figure out how you're going to avoid whatever that outcome is you're afraid of. But Todd, you're probably the most successful software geologist I've ever met.
Well, that's good. I'd like to meet the rest of them, actually.
Yeah, honestly, you're the only one I've ever met. But I love what you do. Love how you incorporate purpose into what you do and how you're building talent and solving problems. And, maybe we'll have you back again at some point.
Love to. Thanks for the conversation, Sean. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. Thank you, Todd.
That was incredible. I felt like it was a learning a minute with him, and he has so much experience, not just, to your point, doing a lot of companies, but working with a lot of people. And I think I want to spend some time during this section hearing your perspective on that. One of the things he talked a lot about was this importance of understanding stakeholders. What stood out to you about the importance of really understanding all of those different stakeholders?
Something that I think is missed so many times is this concept of organizational change management. And then further into that, Todd's point about not treating your stakeholders as one group, recognizing that, and I think this should ring true for everyone, if I'm talking to the quality team, are they more or less risk averse than, say, the sales team? Right? These people, and I'm stereotyping a little bit, obviously within those teams, different people will have different risk tolerances. But when you think about your stakeholder groups and how to implement a change at scale, understanding the R&D team, they get paid to think up new things. They don't get paid to do the same thing the 1,000th time. Their needs and desires and motivations are going to be very different than the quality engineering team or the production team who, once something works the way they want it, they're motivated not to mess it up. Very different motivations, very different incentives, very different mindsets in those organizations and cultures. So Todd's recognition that I can't just say, okay, well, I kind of did a survey, I did some listening, and now I'm going to go implement this, but he's got to basically go sell it organization by organization based on the outcomes that would be meaningful to them. Anybody listening to this that has a little more gray hair like I do, it's the old Zig Ziglar quote from the late 90s that, everybody listens to the same radio station. It's WIFM.
Mm-hmm.
What's in it for me? And you have to go understand what they want in it for them and help them see the benefit. Now, he also had some good examples of where, hey, this is a corporate initiative. We're making this change. And, you essentially are going to run it, whether they get on board or not. The company's still doing this thing. But then as the leader, you really have to understand, can we win with, let's assume we're talking about an additive initiative, if the R&D organization only gives us compliance versus commitment? Ooh, I don't know. By the same token, purchasing, I might be able to win if all I get is compliance out of purchasing. But thinking that through stakeholder by stakeholder group, I thought was genius on his part.
Mm-hmm. I love it. We say a lot around here, you need to lead from their needs, not manage from your own. And I think he nailed it in this interview. The other thing that really stood out to me is stakeholders are dynamic, but so is context and execution. And sometimes an idea isn't enough. And you're laughing because maybe that's happened even here, hypothetically. But hypothetically, but talk a little bit about how execution and what that really means in context sometimes beats ideas every time.
Well, again, Todd nails this so well. And part of his exposure to so many companies, I think really makes him an expert at this and understanding, adopting additive. Well, at a high enough altitude, that sounds like a good idea for almost anybody, right? But then getting into it and saying, what context are we operating in from a, business outcomes, cash position, our risk tolerance, organizational capability, and what might have been a great decision, for instance, during COVID, where, I can't get parts from, whether it's Taiwan, wherever you might have something produced. I have to, in that case, you may have thought onshore. Now, here we are, late 2025. Maybe the right answer is really nearshoring, not onshoring. We'll spare the whole tariff conversation for its own episode. Understanding context and having someone who is leading at a level, and this is what I heard Todd calling out, is somebody who's leading at a level where they're not just running the play, right? And we preach this here at B9 with our leadership team all the time. The goal is not run these initiatives. The goal is drive the business plan to success. And so somebody running an additive initiative who's looking at it at an altitude that says, okay, when we started, yes, this was the right answer. How do we need to adjust as context changes? And how might I need to go back to all those different stakeholder groups we talked about and continue to communicate or maybe change what I communicate? I thought he nailed it.
I also thought for someone that works in software, he had a pretty hot take on AI. And it's not just, let's automate everything. And this applies not just to AI, it applies to additive and technology. But he talked a lot about you need to elevate people, not just automate everything. What was your takeaway from that part of the conversation?
Well, I think the exact quote was, don't automate crap,
I think it
right?
was.
Elevate the people. And I love that, especially when you hear somebody with Todd's background and, being all about software and technology. When you hear a leader like that say, ultimately, it's about leveraging the technology to elevate the people. Oh my gosh, everybody needs to write that down, put that on your desk, look at it every day when you're being bombarded with AI, emails and podcasts and all those things. But at the end of the day, I'll go back to that stakeholder management thing. Today, maybe not going to be true forever, but today, Grok, Claude, ChatGPT can't understand all those people like you do and can't develop that plan like you can. Now, maybe someday when we all have this Neuralink chip that Elon's working on in our head, all of our thought processes and emotions are uploaded and maybe you can do it that way. But for today, you're going to have to think about how you leverage the technology to enable your people to perform at a higher level rather than simply, how do I implement AI and get rid of some people?
I think the last place I'm just curious for your opinion on is you talk about change management. Todd talks a lot about it too, but there's also this aspect of readiness, not just compliance versus commitment, but when do I know an organization is ready to absorb this? And there's something we lovingly call speeding versus parking tickets here that I think plays into this. Talk a little bit about your takeaway from that part of the conversation with Todd.
Well, again, he, for a mining engineer, incredibly adept at leading large organizations and understanding those dynamics. I think, if you take what he said, kind of combine that with my own experience, you have to recognize if we said, hey, running is good for you, we should run a marathon. I don't know about for you. I could not do that today. I don't have the physical capability. Could I get there? Yes. I have done it before many, many moons ago, but you've got to understand where an organization is today. And sometimes that's a great way to have that stakeholder conversation is to go to the leader of one of these organizations and say, corporately, we're looking at how to better leverage additive technology, AI, whatever it is, and thinking about how we can accelerate ROI, make our overall strategy more successful. Here are some ways I think this could impact your part of the organization. How ready do you think your team is and your part of the organization is to take something like that on? At the end of the day, leadership is all about behaviors. Decisions happen instantaneously. Some people can get in a room, and if they're high enough up and say, hey, we're going to leverage AI, great. Those 5 people, maybe the board of directors, whoever, made that decision. But actually making the change takes time, and it boils down to behaviors. Even with additive, yes, a printer might produce a part, no different than an injection mold produces a part, but you have a whole company value stream that is made up of a culture and behaviors that people execute to deliver success with that technology. With additive, some of those behaviors have to be different. And being able to articulate to people, when we implement this, what new behaviors will be expected of you and how will you know if you're actually getting those behaviors? I loved how he focused in on the importance. If you can't lead the people through it, the business can't be successful with it. And so many times, that's where this, we see partnerships emerge. And Danny and I have had numerous conversations with companies that are about, hey, come do a project for us, and then we're going to bring this in-house. And what it turns out is we end up with a longer-term partnership, not always around the same project, but companies realize, this is complicated. Now, organizational, evaluation of capacity, organizational change management. If you ask most companies, like, when you need help with that, where do you get it? They would throw out consulting firm names. I think part of the reason, and Todd touched on this, that you need someone who understands the technology, but also understands the human and organizational element to really succeed at this, especially when you think about at scale. And he told some stories in there about, all of a sudden becoming a remote employee. And, since Todd opened the door, I'm going to, amen it a little bit, but this concept of how do you become a talent magnet as a leader? When you think about this concept of organizational capacity, and he says, yeah, I had this team. I was getting some people that, weren't the number one draft picks, and I knew I couldn't win that way as a leader. I had to build a team and build a culture that would attract people that could perform at the level that I wanted to identify with my leadership brand, and recognizing that his key to delivering on his own performance objectives tied back to how to enable those, getting the right talent, but then how do you enable their performance at the right level, all the way back around to the technology piece, right? And so, again, there's nobody I would rather have had said, don't automate crap. It's about elevating the people, than somebody from Todd's background. And I just hope that all our listeners will take that to heart and get to the point that you can have that conversation intelligently inside your own organization.
And for those of our listeners who are driving and thinking, dang, I should have written that down, where can they find this?
Well, so we will do our best to capture all these nuggets in our show notes. What we want to do is provide you over time, through this lens of business, technology, and people, best practices that can help you go succeed with this on your own. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, yep, show notes are great, but I'd like an opportunity to talk this through, what would they do?
Well, you can reach out to us, and we have a great network as well. So if you want to move from insight into actual execution, find us at b9c.com/additive advantage. You can also follow us on Apple or Spotify, or head over to YouTube and watch this episode there on the Additive Advantage podcast. If you like what you heard, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or a 5-star rating on Spotify. It goes a long way. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn so you know when each new episode drops. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.